Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. My topic for tonight is: has Oreshnik, the new intermediate range ballistic missile, has it increased or lowered the likelihood, of nuclear war? So that's a pretty big topic, and we're going to explore it by examining the views of Alistair Crook and Scott Ritter. Don't know how many people will be here tonight. I only scheduled this almost on the spur of the moment. So if any of you are here, please share, like, and subscribe this so we can get some folks here for it. I'm going to share the stream on my Facebook now before I actually start off. I'm going to start by going over a video of an interview of Alistair Crook on the Judging Freedom program. Alistair Crook is being interviewed by Judge Napolitano, and we'll go over the interview, do commentary on it, skip a little from time to time. So let's begin. Let me share this for you. Hello, Evelina. Hello, Dee. Nice to see you both here. Here is the video of Alistair Crook where he states his views.
Alistair Crook, good day to you, my friend, and welcome here. Thank you for joining us as always. Since we were together last, largely in response to the American and British authorization for Ukrainians to deploy with American and British technical assistance long-range missiles into Russia, the Kremlin responded with some new supersonic device that the world had never seen, which apparently can't be shot down. What was the reaction amongst European elites to the use of this device to destroy a military storage facility in Ukraine?
It's barely mentioned, hardly noticed in the press. It's just largely ignored. And I would say to you, I know you probably had others on the program, but this is really a thunderbolt because it's checkmate that Putin has done. Because against these escalations by ATACMS and Storm Shadow and Scalp, etc., he was always bound by the sort of sense that what's the only next step could be possibly a nuclear step. But what he's done is he's found the solution in that he's no longer bound by that with the Oreshkin missile. he is able to escalate against Ukraine, but also the whole of European and those behind the curtain, those that are supporting the attacks into Russia. He can do that with a conventional non-nuclear weapon that no one can shoot down. And it puts all of Europe into a bind because it changes the whole escalatory paradigm. It was, if you like, that Putin had no choice but either to go nuclear or to go to threatening rhetoric, which most of the West didn't believe. Now with Oreshkin, he has a conventional weapon that can be used against Europe or others. And where is America? America now largely has only one answer to this. It is, if you like, trapped in an all or nothing dilemma, either to go nuclear or, if you like, just to make sort of pointless gestures of sending more ATACMS and more storm shadows, which Russia has proved it can easily manage. It shoots down 90% of ATACMS on average over the last period. So it suddenly changed. So Putin has the escalatory dominance now. And what does Europe and NATO and the United States do? Well, so far, all we've had, and I think probably you've mentioned it on your show, I've been traveling, but I think we saw this Vice Admiral Buchanan saying not only is the United States preparing for a war, a nuclear war with Russia, but it is a war they intend to win and to keep sufficient nuclear deterrence to maintain America's leadership position in the wake of that war. He said that on the day before Oreshnik was actually launched. What does that mean? It means, basically a preemptive strike on Russia. That's the only way of understanding what he means by keeping sufficient deterrence in the wake of the war to be able to deter other states and to keep America's leadership. Now, okay, we may say, well, was he authorized to speak? Isn't he going over the top? He was from the strategic command and therefore is in that loop and is responsible for some of that planning. But in Russia, it had a much more profound effect. And people see the strikes into Russia, deep strikes by ATACMS, and then these sort of statements as saying that, the West is gearing up for a war. And why? Because I think we're in another different paradigm, because really what this new weapon has done has inverted the whole, if you like, strategic, the geopolitical paradigm that we live in. Because for now, how we have it where we are is, America used to launch the Forever Wars. The Forever Wars were about increasing American leadership primacy through the region, American hegemony. That's what their purpose is. Now, the threat of the wars, what's happened in Ukraine, what's happening against Iran, is about the the internal American war. It's about disrupting Trump, disrupting him on Ukraine by pulling him into a situation where he's compelled to escalate. And
Okay, so there are a number of important points in that particular clip, okay, that we played. I think the most important one is that with the alternative of using this new missile, um, the Oreshnik, there's no need for Putin to threaten to retaliate against the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, okay, and other missiles, okay, of that kind, okay, in a convincing way that would involve, a nuclear option. He doesn't have to do that. He has a middle way, okay, because this particular missile, the Oreshnik, is so destructive. We'll get into how destructive it is later when we go over Scott Ritter's explanations. But it is extremely destructive. One such missile can totally destroy a base of military operations that is very, very large. The factory that was attacked by Russia, the Yuzmash factory, it was called, was a very big place. Now it does not exist anymore. It was killed with a single missile. Now the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows are not nearly as effective. First of all, 90% of them can be shut down, okay, as Alistair said. Only 10% of them can arrive. Okay, now they are destructive, okay, and they can damage places, but they cannot totally destroy those places. Since most of the Russian assets are beyond the reach of the ATACMS, which have a range of roughly 190 miles, so from Russia's standpoint, they are pinpricks. They aren't really serious attacks. They accomplish very little to change the character of the war. That is not really their purpose. Their purpose is to get Russia to escalate, but to get Russia to escalate in such a way that it's not so ruinous that it changes the course of the war. What Putin was showing here with this particular missile, the Oreshnik, he was showing he could retaliate in a devastating way without going to nuclear war. So if the Americans want to start a nuclear war, then he can leave it up to them. But he can retaliate in a totally damaging way. Without actually escalating to a nuclear war. Now that is a change in the situation. It's a change in the escalatory paradigm okay, as Alistair Crook has said. Okay, the second point, which Alistair is making, of course, is that these escalations by the Biden administration are motivated by the desire of the deep state uh, to try to chain um, Trump up. So he has no choice but to continue the conflicts in Ukraine and in Israel. The purpose is to get him so mired down that he doesn't try to do some of the radical things that he's mentioned, such as, for example, getting out of NATO. So Alistair makes the point that was a key purpose of using the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows, things like that. Get the United States so embroiled in the war that when Trump takes over on January 20th, he's not able to get out of it, even if he wants to get out of it. So what is Alistair saying? He's saying that the Oreshnik, by giving another alternative, other than a nuclear war alternative to Putin, this is making nuclear war less likely as opposed to more likely. Now, I stated this view myself in my Saturday night stream, but as we shall see, it doesn't seem to be a dominant view. More people are looking at the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows and are thinking that they increase the risk, okay, of nuclear war. And when Putin responds with an Oreshnik, that doesn't really necessarily lower the probability of our getting into a nuclear war. Anyway, let's go on with Alistair here.
Can't go off and sit and talk to Putin. And it's also intended to pull Trump into, with his heavy promotion of Israel firsters into his team, pull Trump into, first of all, becoming a co-conspirator in what Netanyahu has been doing, with all the carnage that it has entailed, and even take it to war with Iran, because ultimately Netanyahu has been wanting an American, if you like, security state, has been arguing really since 9/11. It was the first time in 9/11 that they said the ultimate aim is for war with Iran. Why war with Iran? Not because it's threatening Israel directly, but because Iran, 98% of its oil goes not to Europe, to China. And China is very dependent on Iranian. But more than that, the whole investments, the heavy investments of China, of Russia in the BRICS corridor, we call it the BRICS corridor in the heartland of Asia, is really dependent on Iran for the corridors, for the trading corridors, north, south, and east, west, and also Iran's, if you like, trading expertise in the region. It's absolutely important to the whole if you like, conjuncture of China, Russia, and Iran is to keep Iran. So collapsing Iran is probably seen by some in Washington as a means to contain China, to weaken China. Not just.
So that's another crucial point. The reason why the deep state is interested in the Iranian war, trying to continue the Iranian war, is to strike at China, okay, and to weaken it. Of course, the reason why I wanted to start or to provoke the Ukraine war is because it was interested in weakening Russia. Why was it interested in weakening Russia? Because it viewed Russia as China's partner, and it felt if it was possible to have regime change in Russia, this would also weaken China. The main objective of the deep state is to weaken the main rival of the United States going forward, which the deep state seems to think is China, because the population of China is so large, it's getting so rich, and so on. But in this development, okay, of the Oreshnik missile, the Russians are almost managing to say that even though we are much smaller than China, even though we only have 150 million people, we are still, okay, a great power. And not only that, from a military point of view, it is we who are the greatest power on Earth, not the United States and not China, because neither of them have an answer to the Oreshnik missile. Not that China has to have an answer. It'll probably be getting some of those missiles from Russia. Okay, but neither one has that capability. And of course, the United States doesn't have that capability either. Okay. So, let us go on with it.
Just Iran, but to weaken China.
Before we get into Israel, a few more questions about Ukraine. It's kind of startling in light of your analysis, which, Alistair, is consistent with the analysis of all the other folks on this show: Larry Johnson, Ray McGovern, Colonel McGregor, Colonel Wilkerson, Scott Ritter, and others, that there's not been a peep about this in the European media from the European elites. Similarly, over here, there's not been a peep about Admiral Buchanan. I mean, what Admiral Buchanan said, unless it was authorized by his superiors, is a fireable offense. And if it was...
Yeah, it's so weird that the news, okay, of the Oreshnik has been downplayed both in Europe and here in the United States. And the statements of the Admiral Buchanan, as bellicose as they were and as risky, okay, as they were, just ignored by the mainstream press. How long is it going to go on that the mainstream press here in the United States and the media in Europe are going to continue keeping the populations of both Europe and the United States truly ignorant of some of the most important news that is going on. It is ridiculous.
Was authorized by his superiors. They should be fired for even suggesting that a nuclear war could be waged, much less could be won. So a couple of questions. Was the United States shocked and surprised at the strength, at the existence and power of this missile that Kremlin fired? And why no response from European elites? I mean, Sir Keir Starmer is as responsible for this as is President Joe Biden.
Because it was a bolt from the blue. It was unexpected. And it is more than that. It is a game changer in as I described, that now Putin is not bound to move to a nuclear confrontation. He doesn't have to go down that route. He has the alternative. And they have a stockpile. He said they have a stockpile of these Oreshkin missiles. And he's not compelled any longer to sort of threaten nuclear war. He has now an entirely conventional war. It can be a nuclear missile, but it is essentially gives him the option of only a conventional retaliation against Western escalation. And the big question, and the question I don't know, and I think is why there's such a silence, is now what does Europe do? What does NATO do? Does it go on escalating? So far, the language has been yes. France has promised that it will use its Scalp missiles into it. Britain has sent its chief of defense staff to Kiev, Admiral Radican, to talk to the Ukrainians about how to use better Scalp, not the Scalp, the Storm Shadow missiles, the British missiles, deeper into Russia. And I mean, the real point is we call them long range, but they're not really long range. They're only 190 miles or 300 kilometers.
Okay, I'm going to stop the video here. And I want to shift over to more of the point of view, of Alistair, from a piece that he published over the weekend that appeared at the UN's Review. I'll share the piece with you. The piece is focused on Trump and Trump's storm, quote unquote. It's called "The Counterinsurgency is, quote, on, unquote, against Trump's storm." And Alistair wrote it 3 days ago on November 22nd. And I'm going to go through this now in detail. Well, here's a picture of a rocket or a missile. I have no reason to believe, this is one of the ATACMS. That's what this is. It's an ATACMS. More than just a dangerous provocation aimed at Russia, the ATACMS and Storm Shadow attacks represent an attempt to turn foreign policy on its head. Quote, the deep state whispered to Trump, quote again, "You cannot withstand the storm," unquote. Trump whispered back, quote, "I am the storm," unquote. The war is on. The deep state has launched a war of disruption to disable Trump's storm, quote unquote. This week's attack strike was but one part to an interagency counterinsurgency, a political strike directed at Trump. So too are all the interagency false narratives attributed to the Trump camp. And so too the escalating provocations directed at Iran. Be assured the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes are the United States, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, and Australia, if I got all five right. Okay, of course, the fifth is the US. Be assured, the Five Eyes are full participants in the counterinsurgency. Macron and Storma openly conspired together in Paris, ahead of the U.S. announcement to promote the ATACMS strike. I have to add, that Macron is not one of the Five Eyes. The interagency grandees clearly are very fearful. They must worry that Trump may expose the, quote, Russian hoax, unquote, that Trump in 2016 was a Russian asset, quote unquote. And by the way, now they have another hoax that's going on. Huh?
How can it be an asset?
Well, I think that's fiction. I don't think that. I don't think that Trump was ever a Russian asset, nor do I think that Tulsi Gabbard is a Russian asset, which is the way some are smearing her, right now. But anyway, may expose the Russian hoax, quote unquote, that Trump in 2016 was a Russian asset and put them in jeopardy. But Trump understands what's afoot. Quote, we need peace. This is a quote from Trump. Without delay, the foreign policy establishment keeps trying to pull the world into conflict. The greatest threat to Western civilization today is not Russia. It's probably more than anything else ourselves. There must be a complete commitment to dismantling the entire globalist neocon establishment that is perpetually dragging us into endless wars, pretending to fight for freedom and democracy abroad, while they turn us into a third world country and a third world dictatorship right here at home. The State Department, the defense bureaucracy, the intelligence services, and all of the rest need to be completely overhauled and reconstituted. To fire the deep staters and put America first, we have to put America first, unquote. This is a particularly coherent statement for one of Trump's. And unfortunately, it seems completely at variance with the appointments he's been making to the defense establishment, all of which seem to be both globalist and neocon. So that's kind of a contradiction. Whilst the long-range ATACMS launch, unquote, deep Russian pre-2014 territory, unquote, is no game changer. It will not change the course of the war. ATACMS regularly are. And 90% down by Russian air defenses. The salience of this act, however, is not strategic. Rather, it lies with the crossing into the realm of direct NATO attacks on Russia. Here I have to comment that while the ATACMS launch on Russia is not a game changer, the Russian attack on the Ukrainian factory with the Oreshnik, that is, a game changer, because there is no other conventional weapon that can be so devastating as the Oreshnik has been to that particular factory, and that is so resistant to any form of defense. That is a game changer. Now, let's say Russia has a small stock of 20 of the Oreshniks. He can obliterate key areas, air bases, central downtown areas of major cities, of 20 major cities and air bases inside of NATO. That is a game changer. And he can do it without sending planes. All he has to do is send a number of missiles from Russia. And as various people have said, it's only 19 minutes but to London, maybe 17 minutes to Paris, to Germany, perhaps 11 minutes, to Sweden and Finland, just a few minutes, to Poland, a few minutes, to Romania, just a few minutes. And one missile can wreak tremendous destruction on these areas because one missile carries 36 different, munitions. I don't know whether to call them that or say they're bombs, okay, or whatever. 36 payloads from a single missile, operating at hypersonic speed, Mach 10 to 12, hitting the ground with hypersonic force. The force is so great, they don't even need to use explosives. They don't even have to load the missiles with TNT. That's not necessary because the kinetic energy from the warheads is so great that it totally destroys everything. And yet it still comes in as a conventional weapon. Colonel McGregor reports that two sources are telling him that, quote, Russian nuclear rocket forces are on full alert. They're at the highest level of readiness ever achieved. It suggests that Russia has taken this crossing of the line very seriously, unquote. Yes, it was a provocation, and President Putin will respond appropriately. He has to, but not necessarily through nuclear escalation. Why? Because the war in Ukraine is moving rapidly in his direction, with Russian forces closing in closing in on the Dnieper East Bank. Effectively, facts on the ground will be the outcome determinant, leaving little point to external mediation. But more than just a dangerous provocation aimed at Russia, the Attack'em and Storm Shadow attacks represent an attempt to turn foreign policy literally on its head. Instead of policy being aimed directly at a rising foreign adversary threatening U.S. hegemony, it is being transformed into a loaded weapon locked onto America's domestic war. It is aimed specifically at Trump to, quote, hog tie, unquote, him in, and to divert his attention to wars that he does not want, or at least that he says he does not want. Logic suggests that Trump would want to keep clear of Netanyahu's scheming for a war against Iran. But the Israel firsters, quote unquote, and the lobby, as Professor Jeffrey Sachs argues, long have had effective control over Congress and the U.S. military more than does the president, explains Sachs, quote, because the Zionist lobby is so powerful. Netanyahu basically has had control over the Pentagon to fight wars on behalf of Israeli extremism. The war in Iraq in 2003 was a Netanyahu war. The attempt to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria the overflow of Gaddafi in Libya, all were, quote, Netanyahu wars, unquote. The important point is that Netanyahu can, quote, do what he does, unquote, because there's always planned this way, a plan that has been 50 years in execution. The, quote, Israel First strategy, unquote, was fully embraced by Scoot Jackson, a 2 times candidate for the presidency, and just so the policy could not be rolled back, Scoop insisted on Zionists staffing the State Department and that neocons and Zionists hold the reins at the National Security Council. That same pattern continues until today. At bottom lies the ultimate boondoggle by which the political class of both U.S. parties become wealthy and afford the campaign costs of remaining by legislators. Quote, it's quite a dandy deal that the Israel lobby or the Zionist lobby puts in, say, $100 million into campaigns, and it gets trillions out. Trillions, not billions, trillions out in government expenditures. And so, when Netanyahu speaks, it's bizarre to me, but it is not Trump who is appointing or naming those, quote, Israel firsters, unquote, who are part of his team, but Netanyahu, unquote, Sachs says. When Netanyahu describes Trump's Israel First, quote unquote, nominations as his, quote, dream U.S. team, unquote, the explanation is not difficult to see. On the one hand, Trump has a revolution to conduct in America and wants his nominations to office approved. And on the other, Netanyahu has a further war he wants the U.S. to fight for him. Quote, the big ugly was always a description of the battle that few understood, another commentator notes. Quote, the Senate is factually the core of Republican opposition to MAGA and President Trump. The visible battle consumes the most attention. However, it is the less visible battle against the entrenched ideological Republicans that proves to be the hardest, unquote. The Republicans in the upper chamber will not relinquish power easily. They have a multitude of weapons to use against the Trump insurgency. We are seeing this play out now in the alignment of Republican senators who stand in opposition to Trump's nomination of Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, as this recent report explains, unquote. Quote again, the basic outline is that the Senate leadership will reluctantly support Matt Gaetz for Maine Justice. By the way, this did not come to pass. As we know, Matt Gaetz is out now. He's dropped out of contention because the ethics report in him was leaked in the House, and he could not take the heat. Where, quote, support, unquote, means they will not directly oppose. In exchange for the nomination of FBI Director Mike Rogers, a co-founder of the, quote, Never Trump, unquote, group to defend interagency interests at FBI. On the other hand, there's been no nomination for the FBI director yet, so we don't know whether Trump is going to go through with that supposed deal now that Matt Gaetz is out of there. The prospective Republican Senate leader, John Thune, who will play his cards carefully in order to extract the maximum amount of damage he has leveraged by trying to connect Trump to Netanyahu's carnage in the region. Thune, while announcing huge quantities of weapons for Israel, said, quote, to our allies in Israel and to the Jewish people around the world, my message to you is this. Reinforcements are on the way. In 6 weeks, Republicans will reclaim the majority in the Senate, and we will make clear that the United States Congress stands squarely in Israel's corner. Trump will need to play his cards carefully, too, since for his purposes, the absolute priority are his 2 domestic wars. First, quote, dismantling the entire globalist neocon establishment, unquote. And secondly, ending the out of control government expenditure that has bloated the deep state boondoggle and turned the U.S. real economy into a shadow of its former self. Trump needs those radical reform nominations to pass, even if he has to sacrifice one or two to secure Senate approval for the others. The Israel First nominees, needless to add, will be approved seamlessly. Of the two, quote, entanglement threats, unquote, to Trump's reform agenda, Russian escalation is the lesser of the two. The Ukraine war is motoring steadily towards some form of denouement, one that works for Russia. China's in the driving seat and does not need a major war with NATO, nor does Putin need Trump's, quote, art of the deal, unquote. A resolution of some sort will occur without him. However, Trump's role will be important subsequently to define a new border between the security interests of the Atlanticists and those of the Asian heartland, including China and Iran. The other putative war, Iran, is the more dangerous to Trump. Jewish political influence in the lobby has taken the U.S. into multiple disastrous wars before, and now Netanyahu desperately needs a war, and he is not alone. Much of Israel is clamoring for war that will end, quote, all the fronts, unquote, facing it. There is a profound conviction in its prospect as the solution and the, quote, great victory, unquote, Netanyahu and Israel so desperately need. The ground has been dug over, both by propaganda that Israel's nuclear program is staggeringly vulnerable, which it isn't, and by the media's onslaught that replays the meme that to attack Iran now represents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, with Hezbollah and Hamas already weakened. War with Iran, totally erroneously, is thus being sold as an easy war. That, by the way, is totally false. Hamas is still surprisingly strong, considering all the punishment that has been dealt out to Gaza. And Hezbollah is straight out winning the war against Israel. Just yesterday, they fired 500 missiles into Israel. Missiles and rockets and drones. 500 flying objects into Israel, exploding things in Haifa, in Tel Aviv, now in central Israel. Hezbollah keeps getting stronger and more destructive. There is an unshakable certitude to go on with the article that it must be so. Quote, we are strong and Iran is weak, unquote. That, of course, is also false. We are waiting now for the Iranian retaliation to October 26th. It's a month that we've been waiting, but reports are it's really going to happen now very shortly. We shall see. Who will roll back the Israel firsters? They have the momentum and the fervor. A war against Iran will fare badly for Israel and the United States. The wide ramifications likely will precipitate precisely the severe financial and market crisis that could derail Trump's, quote, storm, unquote. That is an interesting possibility from Alistair, a very interesting possibility. This piece was originally published in the Strategic Culture Foundation and is published here at UN's Review by permission of the author, or a representative of the author. So let's, now, and that, I'll take a look at some of your comments. Evelina says, the bit about firing attackers into Russian territory being the consequence of an, quote, internal war rather than part of strategic plan by the U.S., I thought that was an interesting point. I think it is a very interesting point. Evelina says, quote, no strategic military plan, unquote. and apparently not a strategic military plan at all, but perhaps a military plan aimed at forcing Trump to fight wars that he doesn't want to fight. So I'm going to get to Scott Ritter now. I'm going to start by sharing quite a long article from Scott. It's a recent article, November 23rd. The name of it is On the Brink. It's from his Substack. And here's a cartoon, okay, of Biden eating some ice cream, saying nice sunset, and in his sunglasses, each one of the lenses has a reflection of a mushroom cloud. And right under it, sorry I scrolled down too fast, there's an old saying, quote, fool around and find out, unquote. Of course, you know that isn't quite the old saying, but it's close enough. On November 19th, Ukraine fired 6 U.S.-made missiles at a target located on Russian soil. On November 20th, Ukraine fired up a dozen British-made Storm Shadow cruise missiles against a target on Russian soil. On November 21st, Russia fired a new intermediate-range ballistic missile. I don't know if it's exactly a ballistic missile. I think it's a hybrid between a ballistic missile and a hypersonic missile being fired under its own power against a target of Ukrainian soil. Ukraine and its American and British allies fooled around, and now they have found out if you attack Mother Russia, you will pay a heavy price. In the early morning hours of November 21st, Russia launched a missile which struck the Yuzhmash factory in the Ukrainian city of Dnipropetrovsk. Hours after this missile, which was fired from the Russian Middle Test Range in Kapustin Yar, struck its target, Russian President Vladimir Putin appeared on Russian television, where he announced that the missile fired by Russia, which both the media and Western intelligence had classified as an experimental modification of the RS-26 missile, which had been mothballed by Russia in 2017, was in fact a completely new weapon known as the, quote, Oreshnik, unquote, which in Russia means, quote, hazelnut, unquote. Putin noted the missile was still in its testing phase and that the combat launch against Ukraine was part of the test, which was, in his words, quote, successful, unquote. There's a picture of Vladimir Vladimirovich, that is Russian President Putin, announcing the launching of the Oreshnik missile in a live television address. Putin declared that the missile, which flew to its target at more than 10 times the speed of sound, was invincible, quote, modern air defense systems that exist in the world and anti-missile defenses created by the Americans in Europe can't intercept such missiles, unquote, Putin said. Putin said the Oreshnik was developed in response to the planned deployment by the United States of the Dark Eagle hypersonic missile, itself an intermediate-range missile. The Oreshnik was designed to, quote, a mirror, unquote, U.S. and NATO capabilities. The next day, November 22nd, Putin met with the commander-in-chief of the Strategic Missile Forces, Sergei Karakiov, where it was announced that the Oreshnik missile would immediately enter serial production. According to General Karakiov, The Oreshnik, when deployed, would strike any target in Europe without fear of being intercepted. According to Karakeyev, the Oreshnik missile system expanded the combat capabilities of the Russian strategic missile forces to destroy various types of targets in accordance with their assigned tasks, both in non-nuclear and nuclear warheads. The high operational readiness of the system, Karakeyev said, allows for retargeting and destroying any designated target in the shortest possible time. Quote, missiles will speak for themselves, unquote. The circumstances which led Russia to fire what can only be described as a strategic weapon system against Ukraine unfolded over the course of the past 3 months. On September 6th, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin traveled to Ramstein, Germany, where he met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who pressed upon Lloyd the importance of the U.S. granting Ukraine permission to use the U.S.-made Army tactical missile system, ATACMS, missile on targets located inside the pre-2014 borders of Russia. These weapons had been previously used by Ukraine against territory claimed by Russia, but which is considered under dispute: Crimea, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Zelensky also made the case for U.S. concurrence regarding similar permissions to be granted regarding the British-made Storm Shadow cruise missile. There's a picture of Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Ukrainian President Zelensky having a nice little talk. Ukraine was in possession of these weapons and had made use of them against the Russian territories in dispute. Other than garnering a few headlines, these weapons had virtually zero discernible impact on the battlefield, where Russian forces were prevailing in battle against stubborn Ukrainian defenders. Secretary Austin listened while Zelensky made his case for the green light to use ATACMS and Storm Shadow against Russian targets. Quote, we need to have this long-range capability not only on the divided territory of Ukraine, but also on Russian territory so that Russia is motivated to seek peace, unquote. Zelensky argued, adding that, quote, we need to make Russian cities and even Russian soldiers think about what they need, peace or Putin, unquote. Austin rejected the Ukrainian president's request, noting that no single military weapon would be decisive in the ongoing fighting between Ukraine and Russia. I have to add here, I think that Austin may be wrong about that. It may turn out that the Oreshnik is decisive in the ongoing fight between Ukraine and Russia. But of course, that remains to be seen. Going on with the sentence, emphasizing that the use of U.S. and British weapons to attack targets inside Russia would only increase the chances for escalating the conflict, bringing a nuclear-armed Russia into direct combat against NATO forces. And Lloyd Austin was undoubtedly correct. On September 11th, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, accompanied by British Foreign Secretary David Lammy, traveled to the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, where Zelensky once again pressured both men regarding permission to use ATACMS and Storm Shadow on targets inside Russia. Both men demurred, leaving the matter for a meeting scheduled between U.S. President Joe Biden and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer on Friday, September 13th. The next day, September 12th, the Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke to the press in St. Petersburg, Russia, where he addressed the question of the potential use by Ukraine of U.S. and British-made weapons. quote from Putin, "This will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries are at war with Russia," unquote, and quote again. And if this is the case, then bearing in mind the change in the essence of the conflict, we will make appropriate decisions in response to the threats that will be posed to us, unquote. President Biden took heed of the Russian president's words, despite being pressured by Prime Minister Starmer to green light the use of ATACMS and Storm Shadow by Ukraine, opted to continue the U.S. policy of prohibiting such actions. And there things stood until November 18th, when President Biden said to be responding to reports that North Korea had dispatched thousands of troops to Russia to join in the fighting against Ukrainian forces, reversed course, allowing U.S.-provided intelligence to be converted into data used to guide both the ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles to their targets. These targets had been provided by Zelensky to the U.S. back in September, when the Ukrainian president visited Biden at the White House. Zelensky had made striking these targets with ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles a key part of his so-called victory plan. After the approval had been given by the U.S., Zelensky spoke to the press. "Today, there is a lot of talk in the media about us receiving a permit for respective actions," unquote, he said. Quote again, "Hits are not made with words. Such things don't need announcements. Missiles will speak for themselves," unquote. The next day, November 19th, Ukraine fired 6 ATACMS against targets near the Russian city of Bryansk. Day after, November 20th, Ukraine fired Storm Shadow missiles against a Russian command post in the Kursk province of Russia. The Ukrainian missiles had spoken. The Russian response: shortly after the Storm Shadow attacks on Kursk occurred, Ukrainian social media accounts began reporting that Ukrainian intelligence had determined that the Russians were preparing an RS-26 Rubesh missile for launch against Ukraine. These reports suggested that the missile came from U.S.-provided warnings, including the imagery, as well as intercepted radio communications from the Kapustin Yar missile test facility located east of the Russian city of Astrakhan. That is a picture of a test launch of an RS-26 missile. The RS-26 was a missile that, depending on its payload configuration, could either be classified as an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, meaning it could reach ranges of over 5,500 kilometers, or an intermediate range ballistic missile, meaning it could fly between 1,000 and 3,000 kilometers. Given that the missile was developed and tested from 2012-2016, this means the RS-26 would either be declared as an IBM and be counted as part of the New START Treaty, or an IRBM, and as such be prohibited by the Intermediate Nuclear Forces INF Treaty. The INF Treaty had been in force since July 1988 and had successfully mandated the elimination of an entire category of nuclear-armed weapons deemed to be among the most destabilizing in the world. In 2017, the Russian government decided to halt further development of the RS-26, given the complexities brought on by the competing arms control restrictions. In 2019, then President Donald Trump withdrew the U.S. from the INF Treaty. The U.S. immediately began testing intermediate-range cruise missiles and announced its intention to develop a new family of hypersonic intermediate-range missiles known as Dark Eagle. Despite this provocation, the Russian government announced a unilateral moratorium of producing and deploying IRBMs, declaring that this would remain in place, the moratorium that is, until the U.S. or NATO deployed an IRBM on European soil. In September 2023, the U.S. developed a new containerized missile launch system capable of firing the Tomahawk cruise missile to Denmark. As part of a NATO training exercise, the U.S. withdrew the launcher from Denmark upon conclusion of the training. In late June 2024, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that Russia would resume production of intermediate-range missiles, citing the U.S. deployment of intermediate-range missiles to Denmark. Quote, "We need to start production of these strike systems and then, based on the actual situation, make decisions about where, if necessary, to ensure our safety to place them," unquote, Putin said. That time, the Western media speculated about the mothballed RS-26 being brought back into production. When Ukraine announced that it had detected an RS-26 being prepared for launch on November 20th, many observers, including me, accepted this possibility given the June announcement by President Putin and the associated speculation. As such, when on the night on November 21st, the Ukrainians announced that an RS-26 missile had been launched from Kapustin Yar against a missile production facility in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, these reports were taken at face value. As it turned out, we were all wrong. Ukrainian intelligence, after examining missile debris from the attack, seems to support this assertion. Whereas the R-26 was a derivative of the SS-27M ICBM, making use of its first and second stages, the Oreshnik, according to the Ukrainians, made use of the first and second stages of the new, quote, Cedar, unquote, Cedar ICBM, which is in turn in the early stages of development. Moreover, the weapons delivery system appears to be taken from the newly developed YARS-M, which uses independent post-boost vehicles, or IPBV, independent post-boost vehicles, known in Russia as Blok Individualnego Razvedenia, BIR, instead of traditional multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, or MIRVs. In the classic weapons configuration for a modern Russian missile, the final stage of the missile, also known as the post-boost vehicle, PBV or bus, contains all of the MIRVs. Once the missile exits the Earth's atmosphere, the PBV detaches from the missile body and then independently maneuvers, releasing each warhead at the required point for it to reach its intended target. Since the MIRVs are all attached to the same PBV, the warheads are released over targets that are on a relatively linear path, limiting the area that can be targeted. However, a missile using an IPBV, again, independent post-boost vehicle, a missile using an IPBV configuration, however, can release each reentry vehicle at the same time, allowing each warhead to follow an independent trajectory to its target. This allows for greater flexibility and accuracy. The Oreshnik was designed to carry between 4 and 6 IPBVs. The one used against Dnipropetrovsk was a 6 IPVE capable system. Each warhead in turn contains 6 separate munitions, consisting of metal slugs forged from exotic alloys that enable them to maintain their form during the extreme heat generated by hypersonic reentry speeds. These slugs are not explosive, Rather, they used the combined effects of the kinetic impact at high speed and the extreme heat absorbed by the exotic ally to destroy their intended target on impact. And that is a picture of the Oreshnik missile impact on the Dnipropetrovsk military-industrial complex. Military-industrial target struck by the Oreshnik was hit by 6 independent warheads, each containing 6 of the munitions. In all, the Dnipropetrovsk facility was struck by 36 separate packages, inflicting devastating damage, including to underground production facilities used by Ukraine and its NATO allies to produce short and intermediate range missiles. These facilities were destroyed. The Russians had spoken as well. Back to the future. If history is the judge, the Oreshnik will likely mirror in terms of operational concept the Soviet-era missile, the Skorost, which was developed beginning in 1982 to counter the planned deployment by the United States of the Pershing II intermediate-range ballistic missile to West Germany. The Skorost was, like the Oreshnik, an amalgam of technologies for missiles under development at the time, including an advanced version of the SS-20 IRBM, the yet-to-be-deployed SS-25 ICBM, and the still under development SS-27. The result was a road-mobile two-stage missile which could carry either conventional or nuclear payload that used a 6-axle transporter erector launcher, or TEL, TL for transporter erector launcher. Both the RS-26 and the Oreshnik likewise use a 6-axle TEL. In 1984, as the Skoros neared completion, the Soviet Strategic Missile Forces conducted exercise where SS-20 units practiced the tactics that would be used by the Skoros-equipped forces. Total of 3 regiments of Skoros missiles were planned to be formed, comprising a total of 36 launchers and over 100 missiles. Bases for these units were constructed in 1985. Here's a picture of the Skoros missile and its launcher. The Skoros was never deployed. Production stopped in March 1987 as the Soviet Union prepared for the realities of the INF Treaty, which would have banned the Skoros system. The history of the Skoros is important because the operational requirements for the system to mirror the Pershing II missiles and quickly strike them in time of war is the same mission given to the Oreshnik missile, with the Dark Eagle replacing the Pershing II. But the Oreshnik can also strike other targets, including logistic facilities, command and control facilities, air defense facilities. Indeed, the Russians just put the new Mk-41 Aegis A-Shore anti-ballistic missile defense facility that was activated on Polish soil on the Oreshnik's target list. In short, the Oreshnik is a game changer in every way. In his November 21st remarks, Putin chided the United States, noting that the decision by President Trump in 2019 to withdraw from the INF Treaty was foolish, made even more so by the looming deployment of the Oreshnik missile, which would have been banned under the treaty. On November 22nd, Putin announced that the Oreshnik was to enter serial production. He also noted the Russians already had a significant stockpile of Oreshnik missiles that would enable Russia to respond to any new provocations by Ukraine and its Western allies thereby dismissing the assessments of Western intelligence, which held that as an experimental system, the Russians did not have the ability to repeat attacks such as the one that took place on November 21st. As a conventionally armed weapon, the Oreshnik provides Russia with a means to strike strategic targets without resorting to the use of nuclear weapons. This means that if Russia were to strike NATO targets because of any future Ukrainian provocation or a direct provocation by NATO, it can do so without resorting to nuclear weapons. Again, the point that I've made, the point that was made by Scott elsewhere, and the point that was made by Alistair Crook as well. Ready for a nuclear exchange. That's the title for the next section. Complicating an already complicated situation is that while the US and NATO try to wrestle with the reemergence of a Russian intermediate range missile threat that mirrors that of the SS-20, the appearance of which in the 1970s threw the Americans and the European allies into a state of panic, Russia has, in response to the very actions which prompted the reemergence of INF weapons in Europe, issued a new nuclear doctrine which lowers the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons by Russia. So, in other words, Russia's new nuclear doctrine was issued in the context of the readying of this of the Oreshnik missile and the reemergence of INF weapons in Europe. The original nuclear deterrence doctrine was published by Russia in 2020. In September 2024, responding to the debate taking place within the U.S. and NATO about authorizing UN to use U.S. and British-made missiles to attack targets on Russian soil, President Putin instructed his National Security Council to propose revisions to the 2020 doctrine based upon new realities. The revamped document was signed into law by Putin on November 19th, the same day that Ukraine fired 6 U.S.-made attackers' missiles against targets on Russian soil. After announcing the adoption of the new nuclear doctrine, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov was asked by reporters if a Ukrainian attack on Russia using ATACMS could potentially trigger a nuclear response. Peskov noted that the doctrine's provision allows the use of nuclear weapons in response to a conventional strike that raises critical threats for Russia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Peskov also noted that the doctrine's new language holds that an attack by any country supported by a nuclear power would constitute a joint aggression against Russia that triggers the use of nuclear weapons by Russia in response. Shortly after the new Russian doctrine was made public, Ukraine attacked the territory of Russia using ATACMS. The next day, Ukraine attacked the territory of Russia using Storm Shadows. Under Russia's new nuclear doctrine, these attacks could trigger a Russian nuclear response. The new Russian nuclear doctrine emphasized that nuclear weapons are, quote, a means of deterrence, unquote, and their use by Russia would only be as an, quote, extreme and compelled measure, unquote. The Russian doctrine states, quote, takes all necessary efforts to reduce the nuclear threat and prevent aggravation of interstate relations that could trigger military conflicts, including nuclear ones, unquote. Nuclear deterrence, the doctrine declares, is aimed at safeguarding the, quote, sovereignty and territorial integrity of the state, unquote, deterring the potential aggressor, or, quote, in case of a military conflict, preventing an escalation of hostilities and stopping them on conditions acceptable for the Russian Federation. Now, Scott points out, Russia has decided not to invoke its nuclear doctrine at this juncture, opting instead to inject the operational use of the new Oreshnik missile as an intermediate non-nuclear deterrence measure. This point is of overwhelming importance because what it means is that Russia chose not to use a nuclear answer to the Storm Shadow or the ATACMS. It decided not to invoke its nuclear doctrine in the face of those attacks because it could and did use the new Oreshnik missile as an intermediate non-nuclear deterrence measure. The issue at this juncture is whether the United States and its allies are cognizant of the danger their precipitous actions in authorizing Ukrainian attacks on Russian soil have caused. The answer, unfortunately, appears to be, quote, probably not, unquote. And here we have a picture of Rear Admiral Thomas Buchanan. Exhibit A, in this regard, comments made by Rear Admiral Thomas Buchanan, the Director of Plans and Policy at the J5 Strategy, Plans and Policy for U.S. Strategic Command, the Unified Combatant Command responsible for deterring strategic attack, i.e. nuclear war, through a safe, secure, effective, and credible global combat capability, and when directed to be ready to prevail in conflict. On November 20th, Admiral Buchanan was the keynote speaker at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Project on Nuclear Issues Conference in Washington, D.C., where he drew upon his experience as the person responsible for turning presidential guidance into preparing and executing the nuclear plans of the United States. The host of the event drew upon Admiral Buchanan's resume when introducing him to the crowd, attacked, which on the surface projected a sense of confidence in the nuclear warfighting establishment of the United States. The host also noted that it was fortuitous that Admiral Thomas could be speaking a day after Russia announced its new nuclear doctrine. But when Admiral Buchanan began talking, such perceptions were quickly swept away by the reality that those responsible for the planning and implementation of America's nuclear war doctrine were utterly clueless about what it is they're being called upon to do. When speaking about the U.S.'s plan for nuclear war, Admiral Buchanan stated that, quote, our plans are sufficient in terms of the actions they seek to hold the adversary to, and we are in a study of sufficiency, unquote. Noting that, quote again, the current program of record is sufficient today, but may not be sufficient for the future, unquote. He went on to articulate that this study, quote, is underway now and will work well into the next administration, and we look forward to continuing that work and articulating how the future program could help provide the president additional options should he need them, unquote. In short, the U.S.'s nuclear war plans are nonsensical, which is apt given the nonsensical reality of nuclear war. Admiral Buchanan's remarks are shaped by his worldview, which in the case of Russia is influenced by a NATO-centric interpretation of Russian actions and intent that is divorced from reality. Quote, President Putin, unquote, Admiral Buchanan declared, quote, has demonstrated a growing willingness to employ nuclear rhetoric to coerce the United States and our allies to accept his attempt to change borders and rewrite history. This week, notwithstanding, was another one of those efforts, unquote. Putin, Buchanan continued, quote again, has validated and updated his doctrine such that Russia has revised it to include the provision that nuclear retaliation against non-nuclear states would be considered if the state that supported it was supported by a nuclear state. This has serious implications for Ukraine and our NATO allies, unquote. Left unsaid was the fact that the current crisis over Ukraine is linked to a NATO strategy that sought to expand NATO's boundaries up to the border of Russia, despite assurances having been made that NATO would not expand, quote, 1 inch eastward, unquote. Likewise, Buchanan was mute on the stated objective of the administration of President Biden to use the conflict in Ukraine as a proxy war designed to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. Seen in this light, Russia's nuclear doctrine goes from being a tool of intimidation, as articulated by Admiral Buchanan, to a tool of deterrence, mirroring the stated intent of America's nuclear posture, but with much more clarity and purpose. Admiral Buchanan did not couch his comments by declaring from the start that when it comes to nuclear war, quote, there is no winning here, nobody wins. You know, the U.S. has signed up to that language. Nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, etc., unquote. And here is an image of the first hydrogen bomb tested by the United States in 1952. When asked about the concept of, quote, winning, unquote, a nuclear war, Buchanan replied that, quote, it's certainly complex because we go down a lot of different avenues to talk about what is the condition of the United States in a post-nuclear exchange environment. And that's a place we'd like to avoid, right? So when we talk about non-nuclear and nuclear capabilities, we certainly don't want to have an exchange, right? Unquote. Scott says, right. It would have been best if he had just stopped here, but Admiral Buchanan continued, quote, I think everybody would agree if we have to have an exchange that we want to do it in terms that are most acceptable to the United States. So it's terms that are most acceptable to the United States that puts us in a position to continue to lead the world, right? So we're largely viewed as the world leader. And do we lead the world in an area where we've considered loss? The answer is no, right? So it would be to a point where we would we'd have to maintain sufficient capability. We'd have to have reserve capacity. You wouldn't expend all your resources to gain winning, right? Because then you have nothing to deter from at that point. Two things emerge from this statement. First is the notion that the United States believes it can fight and win a nuclear, quote, exchange, unquote, with Russia. Second is the idea the United States can win a nuclear war with Russia while retaining enough strategic nuclear capability to deter the rest of the world from engaging in a nuclear war after the nuclear war with Russia is done. To, quote, win, unquote, a nuclear war with Russia implies the United States has a war-winning plan. Admiral Buchanan is the person in charge of preparing these plans. He has stated these plans, quote, are sufficient in terms of the actions they seek to hold the adversary to, unquote. But this clearly is not the case. The U.S. has failed to deter Russia from issuing a new nuclear war doctrine and from employing in combat for the first time in history a strategic nuclear capable ballistic missile. That is the Oreshnik, which is, an IRBM, and it is nuclear capable, though it hasn't been fired with nuclear warheads thus far by Russia. But it could be, so it represents that kind of threat. Here we have to say that each time Russia uses the Oreshnik, it's going to have to be very visible in its preparation for that strike so that everybody can see what's coming, so there can be an evacuation of civilians and military personnel if they wish to go from that area, because the Russians are about only striking military targets and destroying those particular targets. So in situations like that, also, it would be made clear in various ways that they wouldn't be using the nuclear capable version, okay, of the Oreshnik missile. And the United States and others would be able to see from their monitoring from space, would be able to infer whether the Russians were using a nuclear capable version of that missile or not. Going on with Scott's article, though, his plans have failed, and he admits that, quote, the current program of record is sufficient today, but may not be sufficient for the future, unquote. Meaning we have no adequate plan for the future, but we do have a plan, one that is intended to produce a, quote, victory, unquote, in a nuclear war Buchanan admits cannot be won and should never be fought. One that will allow the United States to retain sufficient nuclear weapons in its arsenal to continue to, quote, be a world leader, unquote, by sustaining its doctrine of nuclear deterrence, a doctrine in which the United States, if it does engage in a nuclear exchange, quote unquote, with Russia, would have failed. There is only one scenario in which the United States could imagine a nuclear, quote, exchange, unquote, with Russia, which allows it to retain a meaningful nuclear weapons arsenal capable of continued deterrence. And that scenario involves a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia's strategic nuclear forces, designed to eliminate most of Russia's nuclear weapons. Such an attack can only be carried out by the Trident missiles carried aboard the Ohio-class submarines of the United States Navy. Hold that thought. Russia's on record as saying the use of ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles by Ukraine on targets inside Russia is enough to trigger the use of nuclear weapons in retaliation under its new nuclear doctrine. At the time of this writing, the United States and Great Britain are in discussions with Ukraine about the possibility of authorizing new attacks on Russia using the ATACMS and Storm Shadow. France just authorized Ukraine to use the French-made Scalp missile, a cousin to the Storm Shadow, against targets inside Russia. There are reports that the United States Navy has just announced that it is increasing the operational readiness status of its deployed Ohio-class submarines. And there's a Trident D5 missile launched from an Ohio-class submarine. That picture. It is high time for everyone, says Scott, from every walk of life to understand the path we are currently on. Left unchecked, events are propelling us down a highway to hell that leads to only one destination, a nuclear Armageddon that everyone agrees can't be won, and that the United States is at this very moment preparing to, quote, win, unquote. A nuclear, quote, exchange, unquote, with Russia, even if the United States were able to execute a surprise preemptive nuclear strike, would result in the destruction of dozens of American cities and the deaths of more than 100 million Americans. And this is if we, quote, win, unquote. And we know that we can't, quote, win, unquote, a nuclear war, and yet we are actively preparing to fight one. This insanity must stop, says Scott. Now, says Scott, the United States just held an election where the winning candidate, President-elect Donald Trump, campaigned on a platform which sought to end the war in Ukraine and avoid a nuclear war with Russia. And yet the administration of President Joe Biden has embarked on a policy direction which seeks to expand the conflict in Ukraine and is bringing the United States to the very brink of a nuclear war with Russia. This is a direct affront to the notion of American democracy. By ignoring the stated will of the people of the United States as manifested through their votes in an election where the very issue of war and peace were front and center in the campaign is an affront to democracy. We, the people of the United States, must not allow this insane rush to war to continue. We must put the Biden administration on notice that we are opposed to any expansion of the conflict in Ukraine, which brings with it the possibility of escalation that leads to a nuclear war with Russia. And we must implore the incoming Trump administration to speak out in opposition to this mad rush towards nuclear annihilation by restating publicly its position of the war in Ukraine and nuclear war with Russia, that the war must end now and that there can be no nuclear war with Russia triggered by the war in Ukraine. We need to say, quote, no, unquote, to nuclear war. I am working with other like-minded people to hold a rally in Washington, D.C. on the weekend of December 7th, 8th, and 8th to say no to nuclear war. I am encouraging Americans from all walks of life, all political persuasions, all social classes to join and lend their voices to this cause. Watch this space for more information about this rally. All our lives depend on it. Hashtag no nuclear war. Okay, that's for Twitter. So that was Scott's extensive Substack, okay, on this subject. One thing this article makes clear, it makes clear a number of points, but one point it makes clear, which is buried in the detail of the article, is that Russia didn't go nuclear to reply to the ATACMS because it used the new Oreshnik missiles instead. That indicates that the likelihood, probability of nuclear war is lessened by the appearance of these Oreshnik missiles. They've already avoided what might have been a nuclear attack by Russia. So my point is, it's good to have them around. Furthermore, in addition, since the United States keeps saying they're going to do more ATACMS and more scalps and more storm shadows, then a further attack by the Russians, for example, a decapitation attack on the government of Kiev, in what is it, Bankova Street, I guess it's called, in Kiev. What would happen with an Oreshnik missile attack on that place is that it would destroy the headquarters of the government, of Ukraine. Absolutely level the headquarters and the surrounding area to the ground. Total devastation of the seat of government of Ukraine. It would be a decapitation strike. Of course, Russia had said it would warn people to get out of there. It'll be very, very interesting to see if they do, but my point is it would be an appropriate response to the further use of ATACMS. If in spite of this response, it's still the case that NATO insists on firing ATACMS and storm shadows and scalps into Russia proper, then further appropriate responses might be to use the Oreshniks to level the new American missile base, anti-missile base in Poland. There's a brand new one that opened up last week. It could certainly be leveled and totally destroyed by one of the Oreshnik missiles. There is also a Romanian air base where there are also American personnel and French personnel from which the French scalp missiles are supplied to the Ukrainians. So it would be appropriate for the Russians to retaliate by destroying that base too, using this frightful conventional weapon, to do so. So those would be three other cases in which the Russians would have avoided going to a nuclear option by using the Oreshnik missile. I'm sure by the third use, it would become clear to the Western powers, to the NATO powers, that if they do not want to go nuclear, or to be forced to go nuclear themselves, they have to stop these attacks on Russian soil. Because if they don't, an increasing number of bases and strategic targets would be destroyed by the Oreshnik stockpile, which the Russians have right now. And it wouldn't be long before some major cities got attacked as well, at least the downtown areas of those cities. The Oreshniks probably wouldn't be able to devastate the whole of Paris or the whole of London, or the whole, of Berlin, but they could devastate a significant amount of area in those major cities of Western Europe as the West Europeans begin to get that idea, as they begin to realize what could be done. It seems to me the likely response would be not to have a nuclear war, because, of course, the West lacks the hypersonic missiles to fight that kind of war with. They would be entirely reliant on the Trident, and the Trident would not be sufficient, to prevent counterattacks by the Russians from the ICBM bases that Russia has. So those hypersonic missiles would be coming, and if a nuclear attack from the Trident starts, the nuclear retaliation by Russia would be overwhelming. But the point here is the use of the Oreshniks postpones that particular day, of reckoning. And at some point, a decision would have to be made by the president at the time, either Biden or later Trump, about whether they really want to destroy us all by initiating a nuclear attack. But if they don't, the only other alternative would be for the president to sit down, and to negotiate a new security and development agreement with the Russians and Putin. That should not be such a hard thing. As I said in my Saturday program, it should not be a hard thing for Trump, at all, who has said that he would sit down with the Russians and talk to Putin. Of course, his choices for key cabinet positions so far are sending a different kind of message. But of course, Trump is someone who could reverse all his cabinet appointments in a single day. He's quite capable of that. And maybe when he sees the overwhelming force on the other side, as represented by the Oreshnik missiles, he may come to that kind of conclusion, that talking is better than fighting. Especially since, as I argued in my stream on Saturday night, he could probably make a pretty good deal for himself and for Europe and the United States if he tried to develop a new security framework in accordance with the Russians. I hoped today to share, and to go over one of Scott Ritter's appearance on the Judging Freedom program. And so, Scott goes over some of the stuff I just went over in there, but in that he emphasizes much, much more the situation with respect to how close we are, to nuclear war. What I'm saying here is that I think we are further from nuclear war than we were before Putin decided to use the new missiles. I think the Oreshnik has certainly slowed down the possibility of a nuclear war. We still have that possibility. I totally support what Scott is doing in terms of the rallies and events on December 7th, and December 8th to say no to nuclear war. We need to do that because, of course, at some point, given the retaliation by the Oreshniks, which the Russians are certainly going to do, at some point, the collective West is going to have to make a decision about whether it wants to resort to nuclear war, or not. I don't think the Biden administration really wants to do that. I don't think the government in Great Britain really wants to do that. I think they would do it if they were forced into it. But they won't be forced into it by the Oreshnik, because the Russians would not be invoking nuclear war first. So I think they'll decide in the end to sit down and talk. I certainly hope for that, but I honestly think that they will do that because I think the people making the decisions here in America, who I don't believe are Biden, but are Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Lloyd Austin, will in the end decide against going to nuclear war. And I also think that Putin will just keep on dropping Oreshkins on people. I'm sorry, I said Oreshkins, I meant Oreshniks. I keep on confusing Oreshkin and Oreshnik. Anyway, I think since Putin can keep on dropping those, causing more and more damage, along the way, I think that's all he'll do. And we're back to the situation where does the United States really want to fight a preemptive war with nuclear weapons? I think the executives in the Western countries are going to veto that. In the end, I don't think they're going to support that kind of insane option. Anyway, I urge you all to watch the Judging Freedom program with Scott Ritter. The link to it, is in the description. I won't have time to go into it tonight, but it's well worth watching. Scott says some new things, and he says everything in a very, very passionate way, and you ought to take a look at it because our current situation is very, very scary. Now, back to your comments before I end it. Evelina says, Starmer is in trouble back at home. 1 million signatures secured to repeat the elections of 2024. Yes, I know. His popularity has taken a nosedive. Not sure for what reasons, except I'm sure they have varied and various. They are. They have varied, and various, but there's no question people are serious about, a new election. And Starmer is reacting to the whole thing as if he is going to resign. Now, maybe there won't be new elections if he resigns. I myself have said that what I think that the U.S., what Starmer, first of all, I think Starmer should resign Then the question is, what will the Labor Party do? I think what the Labor Party should do is go on bended knee to Jeremy Corbyn and ask him to come back as the leader of the Labor Party, because Jeremy Corbyn will do the right thing in this particular situation. He will negotiate a new security framework with Russia happily, and he will save the British from devastating Oreshnik attacks, which I think are very, very important. And Evelina says his administration has been almost as inept and basic as Schultz. Yes, I agree. Or various and varied, laugh out loud. And then she says almost as inept as Schultz. Yes. Evelina says, quote, almost unquote, as Snarm has only been in office a few months. John B. has removed any doubt that U.S. projection of overwhelming military power in any other continent is at an end. Naval forces are now but slow-moving, undefendable targets. The REM air power is gone. I don't think the Tridents can easily be detected, even though they are slow-moving compared to air forces, of course. But I think they can get in and deliver their payloads. I don't think the Russians can stop that. So I think that a preemptive attack is possible. I don't think it's possible by air anymore. I don't think it would be completely successful by air. I think the Russians have the forces to intercept a considerable amount of it, while we don't have the forces to intercept their hypersonic missiles, okay, in return. But certainly the capability advantage, okay, is with them. We need to back off. We need to understand that Russia does not desire to govern Europe. It just desires a new security framework so it can attend to its business in Eurasia, okay, in Africa, along with the Chinese and also the Iranians. And I think we ought to let them go do that. And we ought to mind our own business. I think our own business is tending to our own problems at home. And that is true for the Europeans, okay, as well. John B. says, whether the U.S. likes it or not, it's got to pull its head in. Time to concentrate on compounding domestic problems before those social economic problems explode uncontrollably. Can't agree more, John B. That's absolutely what I think. I think we're at a crisis now. There's no question that we're at a crisis that's going to determine all of our futures. I am optimistic. I'm scared, but I'm optimistic that people will opt for not fighting, a nuclear war. I think they will move now in the next few months to create a situation to avoid accidents also. And I think we will find ourselves in a much better situation in just a few months. So I'm going to end the stream here. I will see you tomorrow with my regular Tuesday show. I have a lot more to talk about on that show. John B. says Tridents equals nuclear, no one wins. I know. I'm quite well aware of that. Using Tridents, suicide. Absolute suicide. I have much more to say tomorrow. There are many more good things to note that people are saying. Very interesting things. I'll be back at my regular time of 9 p.m. tomorrow, and I will see you then. I will end the stream here.